All right, so we can start. I'm sure more people are going to join the next few minutes. So yeah, welcome everyone. I'm so excited that you are joining us today, and we're doing this event about PFAS in our blood, rainwater, and lakes. I am Rosa Potter, the Development Director at the Ecology Center, and I'll moderate the event today. So this program is scheduled to last until 6:30. We're going to be hearing presentation from our speakers, and then we will have time for questions after the presentation. Currently, we're gonna keep you unmute or muted. So Laura, if you can just double check everyone is muted. And just during the presentation after that, if you have questions, the questions will be at the end. You can ask questions that you want. You can, since this is a virtual event, you can use your virtual hand when it's time to ask questions. You can see it at the bottom if you want, like on your screen, the bottom. Like I need to find it myself. Oh, at reactions, there is a place where, no, not the reactions. Where is it? I feel like I can't find it right now. Can you find it, Laura? The virtual hand.
In reactions, I think you had it.
Yeah, yeah, I see it now, raise hand. I thought they switched the places. So yes, you can raise your hand, the virtual hand, and then we'll call your name and you can unmute yourself and ask a question that you want. And if you can try to limit your question to like 30 seconds, that'll be great. So we can have more people ask questions and also time for answers. Um, what else I wanted to, if you want, you can pin the speakers. We're gonna have Erica Bloom. She's here, and Jillian Miller. We can, if you want, pin them. We're gonna do that ourselves so you can guys see their face and while they're presenting. But that's something also you can do it manually. You can just click on their screen and then pin them. And this is when they speak, you can see them while they're speaking and presenting. We will record the event today and the material will be available for you tomorrow, the presentation. And I think that's it for the logistics. I want to introduce our presenters for today's event. We have Erica Bloom. She's our Toxic Campaign Director at the Ecology Center. She has a master's degree in environmental health and justice from University of Montana. She's from Michigan, and she has worked in Michigan's environmental and food systems movement since 2010. She has experience in program development, policy, coalition building, and grant writing. And at the Ecology Center, she focuses on leading the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network and supporting projects through the organization's Health is Tough Lab. And we have Jillian Miller. She's our senior scientist. She has experience in analyzing materials in both academia and industry. Julian enjoys combining scientific research with advocacy for a safer and healthier world. And she's an author of many peer-reviewed publications. She also taught university classes in the physical sciences and worked as a scientific editor. She holds a PhD in chemical engineering from Stanford University, where she focused on novel materials for solar cells. So now I'm going to hand it to our presenters. Again, if you want, there's one point I forgot to mention. If you have questions in mind and you don't want to forget it, you can post it in the chat and we will talk about these questions at the end, or if you would like to wait, you can wait until the end and then you can unmute yourself and ask a question. All right, so our presenters can start right now.
Great. Thank you, Laura, for putting up the slides, and thank you, everybody, for attending. We have some interesting small research studies to share. This is all community-driven research in PFAS involving foam on lakes, rainwater, and blood. Next. But before we get into today's topics, for anyone not very familiar with the work that we do in the environmental health team at the Ecology Center, we wanted to show a few of our other recent and current projects just to give you an idea of the array of different hazardous chemical groups that we work on and the different types of samples. So these are some of the recent and current projects. We have an ongoing study related to industrial chemicals in plastic food packaging. In the picture, you can see little pieces of plastic that have been cut up from beverage bottles. We have assisted a number of communities around the country with their attempts to block artificial turf from being installed, and we've helped with chemical testing in some cases. There are concerns about exposure and breakdown and runoff with those materials. We have a number of studies we've done on bisphenol chemicals in store receipts. We published a paper in a scholarly journal earlier last year on that topic, as well as a paper on plasticizers, including phthalates in cooking oils and other foods. So we do kind of a diverse set of stuff, and it's all involving testing with various research questions about different chemicals. Next slide. PFAS projects, which we're going to touch on today, are often very small studies that are in response to community questions and concerns. We did a study on local fish, partnering with anglers who helped collect and prepare the fish for PFAS testing. And then the topics circled in red here are the ones that we're going to touch on today. So to give you some visuals, the foam that forms at lake shores, also on rivers and other water bodies, rainwater, and blood. Next slide. So before we get into the mini studies, just one slide on units, because when we talk about PFAS being measured in blood or water or anything, the units are often going to be part per billion, or we'll also use part per trillion. And so if you aren't familiar and want to know what that is, it's a sort of odd unit, but it's a mass ratio. And if you had 1 part per billion PFOS in blood, that would mean you had 1 microgram of PFOS per 1 kilogram of blood. You'll often see drop in a swimming pool analogies to try to give an idea of what those units mean, but I'm not a big fan of those analogies. So I like to point out things like what's in bold. In 1 teaspoon of water, if there was 1 part per billion PFOS, that would represent 6 trillion PFOS molecules. And those are, of course, distributed throughout whatever medium they're in. You'll hear us mention part per trillion, which is 1,000 times less concentrated than a part per billion. Next slide.
Yeah, so I'm going to take
Turn
this.
it over to Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Jillian. So as Ronza mentioned, I lead the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network, and we wanted to put a slide in here because a lot of the projects that we've been doing in the Healthy Stuff Lab have been in response to community members who have been part of our network. And so we started this network with community members, as well as the Michigan League of Conservation Voters and National Wildlife Federation in 2020, 2021. And the idea is that it's bringing together people from all over Michigan and really all over Great Lakes states to unify around a common, PFAS policies, resourcing communities through funding, skill building, trainings, access to reporters and decision makers. So we've had a lot of events and educational programming. And really, as we've continued this network, a lot of it has come up with communities in their, in their watersheds or neighborhoods saying, hey, we have a lot of concerns about PFAS in our foam in the lake or in the air or in our soils, and the Ecology Center is really equipped, both with our organizing and policy skills, but also as Jillian is talking about, we have scientists and researchers on our staff, and we've been able to really support some of these smaller studies. And so that's really where a lot of this has come from, and community-based science partnering with community members themselves. to be doing a lot of the collection and defining the goals and working with us on how we want to do the media and advocacy. So wanted to make sure that that was highlighted before we get into kind of the bigger projects. Next slide. So the first one we're going to talk about is testing surface water foam on Lake Huron. And we put out a report earlier this year. We worked with a group up in Oscoda, Michigan called Need Our Water. And they were really concerned about surface water foam that was getting up onto the beaches around Lake Huron, because their community has been contaminated by PFAS from firefighting foam through the Wurtsmith Air Force Base. And they had asked Eagle, the state of Michigan, to test the foam repeatedly around Lake Huron. And really there was a variety of reasons why the state, didn't test the foam, but they finally, we talked with them and they said, like, let's do this project as community scientists. And the Ecology Center got some funding to support the project. And we really worked with them to do the collection, sent the foam to the lab, and we have a report on our website now that kind of talks about everything I'm talking about and the results that we got. And really what we were advocating for is not, both that the state tests the foam, but also really that there's more signage and education for the public that they should not be touching the foam and what you should do if you touch the foam. And there's not enough of that on some of these really high use public beaches up in Oscoda. So we're still working on that and trying to get the state to test and do some more signage. Next slide. This is a map of exactly where we tested. So Oscoda is on, as I mentioned, Lake Huron, and we took 4 different samples around on the beaches. And so our results, you'll see in the next slides, kind of correlate with the samples that we took. But one of the things just to note is we also were testing around Tawa City, and that the base is highlighted here. The Wurtsmith Air Force Base is, right there, more north of some of these sites. And so, the group in Oscoda was really concerned and thinking, is some of the contamination actually getting into the lake, and how far down is it going? And, we weren't able to answer all of those questions, but the idea was that we were filling in some data gaps that really the foam hasn't been tested. So, and using that for advocacy. So next slide. Jillian's gonna talk about the results a little bit.
Thank you, Erica. So the 4 samples that were taken of foam on the beaches all had PFAS in them. And in 2 of them, PFOS, which is a notorious PFAS chemical that was traditionally in the firefighting foam, as well as other sources like metal plating plants, but definitely the firefighting foam. That was highest of all the PFAS in 2 of the samples, although 2 of the other samples had PFOS, but the highest levels were from a different chemical, and we're not sure where that comes from. PFUNA is a little bit more similar to PFOA, although it's not PFOA. I'm not sure the source of that. Overall, the results were consistent with Michigan's testing. These units are in parts per trillion, so you have anywhere from a couple of hundred parts per trillion to many thousands of parts per trillion in the foam. These are much more concentrated PFAS levels than you'll find in the water that the foam was sitting on, and that's consistent with other research. And there's a lot of understanding now about why that is. PFAS tend to stick to the organic material that forms the foam. So when you have different weather conditions on different days, that will affect the foam formation, the composition of the foam, and PFAS levels. And of course, PFAS levels in water can vary by other factors too, like the sources. And an example of that is samples B and C in that chart were the same location, but they were collected on different months. And they had somewhat different results, although a similar array of individual PFAS chemicals were found. The levels were different. Next slide. As for what should be done about this, Eric already touched on it, but in addition to helping with the pressure to accelerate the Air Force Base cleanup, which has been a really long slog, and a lot of people have worked very hard on that, the state should set health protective policies, including foam advisories and installing signage on high-use beaches. And finally, to wrap up this section, mini study on foam, we hope that what we did is a replicable model for other communities wanting to do community-based research, and credit to the funders that helped do this work. Next slide.
Yeah, and before we go on to the next project, I also wanted to clarify that the surface water foam is what kind of can build up from PFAS contamination in the water. But that's different than firefighting foam that's actually used in to put out chemical fires. So I just wanted to make sure clarify, because sometimes we're using foam interchangeably, but they're two different. We tested the foam that's being created from PFAS in the water. Okay, so our next project, we looked at rainwater, and this really came out of community members that we worked with through the PFAS Action Network and environmental justice advocates in Detroit, Dearborn, and Flint, who had been concerned about PFAS in the air and really near industrial areas, because there hasn't been as much focus or testing on if PFAS is coming out of industrial facilities, or if it's being spread very widely across regions. And so this was something that the state of Michigan had done some testing of rainwater, and we wanted to kind of do a pilot as well. And we used these buckets. It was a very kind of low tech, but good way to do it. And we deployed these buckets in different cities. And we also, in Flint, we also used, in all of the locations, we used the CycloPure water test kits. And in Flint, we use those exclusively. So I just wanted to highlight our community members that we worked with. This is Salal and Mona and Ben and Teresa, who were instrumental in this project. Next slide. We also worked closely with the College of Worcester. So if people are interested in learning more about, the details, we modeled our study off of what they had done. And they were testing PFAS in Northern Ohio using kind of the similar method of buckets. And we spoke with their chemists before the study, and then when we sent the lab results to Worcester and then talked with them after. So we had very good academic support from them, and it was a really good collaboration as well. Next slide. So
Right.
some of the results. So yeah, go ahead, Julian.
So we're going to go over results that came from the College of Worcester's testing, because they had quite sensitive tests. And they were also able to include a PFAS chemical called TFA, or trifluoroacetic acid, that is often not included currently in a lot of environmental testing. And it's especially important to test for TFA in air because it's a very volatile chemical. It's called an ultra short chain PFAS sometimes. It's a very small molecule, goes into the air easily, travels very long distances. And so researchers around the whole world that have tested air or rainwater as a proxy for air, if they've included TFA, they usually find it, and sometimes at very high levels. So that was one reason for partnering with the College of Worcester that could do that. From the 3 sites that had rainwater tested at that lab, Dearborn and Ann Arbor had especially high levels of TFA, the ultra short chain PFAS chemical. And I should mention that this TFA is a breakdown product of refrigerants. So air conditioners, whether in cars or buildings, extremely ubiquitous things, and industrial facilities, et cetera. But it's very difficult, sometimes near impossible, to track where TFA may be coming from in any particular sample because it can travel so far. Of course, other PFAS chemicals can also travel through air. And to be clear, the rain is being used as a proxy for air PFAS pollutants because rain does bring down pollutants to Earth that were in the air. This chart gives an overview showing total levels of PFAS as well as TFA. And I hope I explained why we pulled out TFA, the trifluoroacetic acid, as a separate chemical. So the first row shows you the Ann Arbor and Dearborn very high numbers. There was TFA in the Southwest Detroit sample as well. Then the next row in that chart shows total PFAS levels. The Ann Arbor and Dearborn levels ended up quite high because of the TFA is in there. If you look at the total PFAS levels without TFA, which is comparable to some other testing that didn't include that chemical, then you'll see that the Detroit and Dearborn samples appear to have significantly higher total PFAS levels than Ann Arbor, which we could speculate might be because they are more industrialized areas. Of course, it's a small study, so we can't make draw any large conclusions. Next slide. To view the same results visually and with a little more breakdown, this chart shows on the vertical axis the concentration of PFAS chemicals in the rain, and on the horizontal axis, the 3 locations. Each colored bar is a different PFAS chemical. Those are listed on the right. We're not expecting anyone to review the individual PFAS chemicals, but just glancing at it shows you the rather large number of individual PFAS that were found in the rain samples, and you can see the Detroit and Dearborn samples having overall more abundant levels. This chart does not include the TFA chemical, and you'll see why in the next slide where it is included, because it dwarfs the other PFAS chemicals. So same chart, but with TFA added. The blue lines are TFA, the really tall ones are the Ann Arbor and Dearborn levels, a much higher concentration. Next slide.
Yeah, and really just to sum up, we think about, well, what can you do around this, and how do we address PFAS in the rain? It really is a global challenge, and there's been a lot of research recently around that PFAS in rain has been detected almost everywhere, that it's actually very hard to get away from it, even if there isn't an industrial area, because it does travel. And there's even been some research and conversation about, the world's population drinking rainwater and how it could be unsafe. And so that's a really, it's sobering. A lot of people are using rainwater and to drink, and not everyone is, filtering out through municipal water systems. And so it's kind of a global issue, as PFAS is, but specifically with rain. And we can't, what we can really work on and control, as we can with the other, the foam and the other studies, is the regulatory structures that are allowing for these PFAS to be entering our environment in the first place. And what a lot of this work, the research that we do and the studies, is in order to influence legislation and permitting and regulatory systems, so that we have better precautionary, preventable measures in place, that we are over time eliminating the source in the first place. So that's kind of the broader look at this, and really wanted to just highlight that piece. No, next slide. So the last study we're going to highlight is PFAS in human blood. The Ecology Center started speaking with a lab called Eurofins, and they had developed a at-home PFAS in blood test kit. So we were really curious about this. It's more and more, these are coming on the market as people kind of understand how PFAS is getting into human bodies. So we had some grant funds. We ordered a bunch of these test kits, and we wanted to both kind of test them out ourselves with our own staff and also have them as a resource for community members who were interested in testing their own blood, either because they had been exposed or that they were, living in a certain geography or had a certain occupation. So we worked again with our PFAS Action Network and some of our partners, and we passed out these test kits to 2 firefighters, someone who had worked in the chemical industry and earlier in life, a resident of Southwest Detroit, a community member who had exposure through drinking water, and then actually the person was turned out to be on dialysis for kidney, which was interesting, and we could talk about that. So this was a small study, but it was something that we really felt like more and more people are very curious about and wanting to know how they could test their own blood. The final thing I'll say on this, to be clear, is the PFAS test really, it only shows a snapshot at the time of when you're getting the blood test. So people who have been exposed for long periods of time, your PFAS levels decrease. And Jillian is actually going to talk more about that. So I'll go to the next slide. I think I'm stealing her thunder a little bit. Okay, next slide.
No problem. There's actually a lot to cover on this topic, so it's totally fine. These results were really interesting. And before I get into this chart, I should mention that these blood test kits only test for a limited number of PFAS chemicals, like all tests. So there certainly probably are others that are not included in the test kit that may show up in some of the same people. So their total PFAS levels represent, just the ones that could be measured in this test kit. Also, if you want to see videos of a couple of staff members, including me, doing these test kits where you get a little lancet and stick your finger to put some drops of blood on the little test kit, those are on our website in an article about the blood testing. So this chart on the vertical axis shows total PFAS levels in the blood, units or parts per billion. And the horizontal axis has each participant with initials, identifying them anonymously, of course. Each bar then represents one person's blood. They're separated into male and female. The blue bars are male participants, and the more orange color are female participants. I will get to that in a moment. I know you can see a difference. Of course, this is not a designed study. We did not control for age or any other factors. The light orange dotted line shows the national median of total PFAS levels in blood of people in the United States tested through the government's biomonitoring program, where they periodically test for a lot of pollutants. So the first thing you'd probably notice is the female-male difference. This is the lower levels of PFAS in women are commonly seen on average. Of course, there's a range for everybody, but on average, in a large statistical pool, you'll see roughly 30% lower levels in women than men. A lot of people have speculated about why. There might be some lifestyle factors. Some definite known factors are the body functions that remove fluids from people's bodies. So menstruation and lactation and pregnancy all, as a side effect, serve to remove pollutants, including PFAS, from the body. So that's almost definitely one factor in that difference. The 2 firefighters were both in male. And their total levels were actually below the national median, although higher than some other participants. The person who was formerly exposed through work to PFAS chemicals is labeled D in the female section. And that's an example of getting a blood result, seeing that you have some PFAS in your blood, and not being able to pinpoint where it comes from or how old that PFAS is. That person may have had much higher levels in the past, and then the body slowly eliminates them, the chemicals, and so they show up at lower levels years later. On the other hand, recent exposure will show up in the blood as well. So it's interesting, but it's important for people to understand the limitations. If you look at the very last participant on the right-hand side of this chart, labeled A, that person had no PFAS detected in her blood, which was a little surprising because just about everybody does. And then we, as Erica mentioned, found out that person is on regular kidney dialysis. And it turns out there's research on this, that dialysis membranes, which are the filters, actually capture PFAS and end up filtering out PFAS chemicals. Next slide. So I think that between Erica and I, we may have covered these points already, but I think that only 7 PFAS measured might be written a little bit incorrectly. Sorry about that. 7 PFAS were detected, but more than that were measured. A snapshot of the last few years of exposure, unless there was a large exposure earlier that is still reflected years later. We talked about the sex differences and dialysis membranes. And we know that diet matters for lots of pollutants in our bodies, and we know that it matters for PFAS, but the details are not concrete enough, really clear guidelines about if you eat this kind of thing, you're going to have high PFAS. It's just not that consistent across all types of food. But a few general things we know are that fast food and takeout containers are more likely to have PFAS in the packaging that definitely is shown to migrate into food. So that's one diet-related factor. We know that freshwater fish can be high. We unfortunately saw that in our own study of local fish from the local rivers and lakes. Seafood can be high. I think it varies. And meat and dairy in some studies show on average higher levels than other foods, but again, not entirely consistent. Next slide. And finally, when talking about something as intimate as blood, people, of course, are curious to know, like, what does it actually mean? And I don't think anyone has a entirely authoritative, perfect answer to that. But we did put some conclusions made by the National Academies of Science recently, who suggested that PFAS blood levels under 2 parts per billion likely won't face elevated health risks. If you look at the results from this mini study, a number of people had higher than 2 parts per billion. And if between 2 and 20 parts per billion, it might be wise to be screened for elevated cholesterol, since certain PFAS can raise cholesterol. It might make sense to be screened for breast cancer if a person has some risk factors, and if pregnant, being vigilant about hypertension. Greater than 20 parts per billion is probably, according to the National Academy, probably more potential for certain cancers and other problems. Next slide. That is essentially the conclusion. Put the summary up here to remind you of the 3 mini studies that we covered. But if you have questions about, about other things we do, you can ask that too, or happy to answer questions about what we talked about today. Thanks so much for listening.
All right. Thank you, Jillian. Thank you, Erica. Any questions? You can, if you want, you can use the reactions and have a virtual hand that you can raise, so we can call your name, and you can ask a question that you want. Does anyone have a question?
I see a question in the chat that I think went to me.
Oh, is it? I didn't see a question in the chat.
But I think this is a good question for Jillian too. It was asking about one of the slides showed the blue plastic gallon, like the drum, basically, that you could store water, or and it was, do these drums contain PFAS? Is that why we were showing that one in particular?
Hey, great eye for detail. Thank you for noticing the drum. That was, it could represent a couple things. It does not mean that a drum that looks like that always has PFAS. Definitely not. They actually can, in some cases, have a fluorinated interior. specialty types of plastic drums can have a fluorinated interior that does that can also then add PFAS to what's inside it. But that is not necessarily the case for all such drums. Those would usually be used to store really hazardous chemicals. And that little graphic was also meant to represent chemical facilities where the contents of the drum might be a PFAS containing chemical. So hope if that doesn't answer your question, follow up.
Was that Harvey? That was your question? Okay, awesome. Erica, do you want to add anything?
I don't have more to add on that. I think Julian did as much as I'd be able to.
Okay, Harvey, if you feel like the question is answered or not, just let us know.
Yeah, no, it was answered. The reason I asked the question is a lot of people have those blue drums repurposed to be rain barrels. And we just fooled around with one this last weekend at the house I'm living in. And that's where the question was coming from. So good answer.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think
it.
it'd be helpful if you knew what the drum was used for. I think if it was used for like harsh solvents, I would be maybe a little concerned about using it. But
a lot of people that got involved with making their own rain barrel got them from food containing sources like pickles. So thank you.
Yeah, so likely not a concern from that source.
I see a question in the chat. Is there a good report that you can recommend which covers all issues PFAS related? Who wants to answer this question? Julian?
Can you repeat the first part of it? A report? Was that the?
Yeah. Is there a good report that you can recommend which covers all issues PFAS related?
I think the topic is just so large that there isn't going to be one report that covers everything. I think it would be overwhelming. We could probably, and it depends on the angle you're looking at, because there's the super technical research into the chemicals themselves, and then there's the whole area of exposure and all kinds of assays and experiments to look for biological effects. And then there are some resources if people are looking for practical information about products in terms of things that we actually might have control over, like what we buy. There is, I think it's called PFAScentral.org. Green Science Policy Institute has tries to keep a list of like brands and companies that have gone PFAS free for people looking for that, but that may not be what you're asking for.
I mean, also our website, right? We have all the reports and all the PFAS studies that we have done so far. That also you can find. The link is on the chat, where you can, go to our website, ecocenter.org, our work, and then you can find the healthy stuff lab work, and you can find a lot of the reports that we did on PFAS. Okay, so there is a question in the chat. Should one be concerned about PFAS in camping tents and clothes in terms of personal exposure?
I could start with this one. I think the general answer is yes, there can be PFAS in a lot of these outdoor weatherproof, things that we didn't really talk about like what the use of PFAS are, but they're really there to be water resistant, grease resistant. So a lot of times outdoor apparel and camping equipment is made with PFAS, and the Ecology Center has been a part of different campaigns. The last couple of years we were part of an REI campaign to get PFAS out of their products. And then, and so I think that, things that are more fabrics and textiles that are made in less synthetic, more natural types of fabrics are likely will likely have less PFAS. So I would say, again, this is one of the things we want to tell people is, you know, you can't shop your way out of the problem. You can make smart decisions, and it's best to have all of the information so that you can choose and make decisions on what you want to buy. But the real part of our work is educating consumers, so that we can make these broader policy changes and regulatory changes, that there are safer alternatives on the market, so that PFAS are not even being, you know, manufactured, and that more research is going into how to manufacture, you know, these waterproof things that don't use PFAS in the first place. So that was kind of a long-winded, you know, answer, but I think you should be concerned generally about some of this personal exposure. Anything you would add, Jillian?
That was an excellent answer. I would only add that, yeah, unfortunately, outdoor gear, tents, clothing, waterproof jackets and stuff and shoes, unfortunately, that's a large portion of PFAS use in consumer products.
Okay, Harvey.
So I think the person who asked that question was really asking a much smaller question. If I'm wearing those clothes, am I being exposed to a concentration that I should be concerned about? If I'm sleeping in a tent that has a PFAS chemical in its waterproofing, you know, that's where it's coming from. I mean, disposal of those clothings, disposal of those tents, the stream of waste, that's a whole other issue. So what do you know about the degree of exposure if I'm wearing a jacket that has PFAS? That kind of thing.
I think it varies quite a lot by, I guess, the particular jacket and how it's made, how old it is, how many times it's been laundered, how much you're sweating, how hot it is. So there are going to be a lot of factors. I mean, the answer is that yes, those chemicals that are used to waterproof fabrics, they do come off. That's been shown. They can be absorbed to some degree through the skin. That's not a very efficient way to get PFAS, so I guess that's good at least. But to some degree. As for whether those levels are risky, I think there are too many factors to say. For tents, it's I guess if you lived for a long period of time in a tent, it might be more important because there'd probably be PFAS in the air. They're going to cling to the dust. In terms of very personal exposure in a tent, if you're doing a short camping trip, I probably wouldn't be too worried just because it's such a discrete amount of time and not long term. But yeah, the clothing, I mean, yeah, there's no way to give a single answer for that. So so yes, there is some human exposure from those clothes. How much it is and how risky it is pretty hard to answer.
There is oh, sorry, Erica, go ahead.
Oh, I would like to add that it is hard to say a specific product category. There are lots of factors, but again, to really highlight how much we are exposed to PFAS in all different parts of our consumer products and lives, they all add up. So if it's one clothing that you're wearing, but then you're also exposed potentially through your furniture or a product that you're using, I think that's kind of how we look at it, is the cumulative exposure of these PFAS, and they're so ubiquitous. You just have to kind of look at it as kind of how do we reduce exposure overall in our lives. That's all.
There is a question also in the chat. Are there regulations which require manufacturers to disclose that their product contains PFAS?
Certain states have managed to create such regulation of about product labeling, like Washington State. I think California has something. I don't know the status of it, and then a couple of East Coast states, because the federal government has not moved to do that. But yes, Washington State and California, I know, have specific product categories, including cookware and I think apparel. So yeah, the labeling laws can definitely make a difference because, of course, it makes it much more visible. And these days, most people have heard of PFAS, and so that can certainly make a difference and put some market pressure on manufacturers. And when large states do that, it can have an influence on, a wider range of products. But yeah, right now it's kind of the states doing that, and not for every type of product. And I don't recall the exact details right now, but some of the product categories that I mentioned and others.
Erica, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I just would add, if you're thinking about like disclosure as labeling to a consumer, I'm not sure if that's the question or if it's like disclosure of what products are to the, our regulatory agency. They're a bit different. And it can be challenging to label because there's PFAS that are in products that kind of get through the whole life cycle of them. So either in the manufacturing process, and they're not even necessarily intentionally added. So just to, make things even worse, sometimes we're exposed to PFAS in these products and the manufacturer has to know what they have to go back in their supply chain and figure out where the PFAS came from, because it's just in the processes in the manufacturer. So it's absolutely necessary that we require that and get to a place where we're figuring that out. But I've heard that can be a challenge for disclosure, or specifically labeling.
So there is a follow-up question about when talked about the tents, camping tents, and there's a follow-up question about that. Could replacements to PFAS have their own issues with harm to the body? Should we trust companies that have replaced PFAS with other substances, but that are not very transparent about those alternatives?
That's a great question. It's a hard one to answer. Unfortunately, the PFAS waterproofing treatments on things like tents work really, really well. And so it sets a high bar for replacements. And certainly a lot of companies are working on that. And yes, that's been like such a repeated problem throughout history of bad replacements for bad actor chemicals. And we definitely don't want that. We're not currently working with companies on replacements, but there are organizations and watchdog groups that do work with companies and hold conferences for sharing information about alternatives. I think a lot of the waterproofing alternatives are polyurethane based, and that's an example of a polymer substance that it has its own issues like manufacturing. There are definitely some pretty toxic chemicals in manufacture. But if you look at like overall life cycle and end of life, how can it be disposed of? It will come out better than PFAS. So it is like, that is certainly a constant challenge. And if a person goes back to, like Erica mentioned, natural materials like canvas and kind of natural waterproofing, like people did a long time ago, there will be it will work to some degree, but it won't be as waterproof as the PFAS stuff. So it's a difficult shift when people get to expect the performance of a higher performance, and then alternatives, they may get frustrated.
Erica, do you want to add something?
No, I don't. I think that's great. There were a couple other questions that were directed to me. I think.
Oh. Go ahead, because I can't see them.
Yeah. I think Harvey wanted to know about kitchen bathroom countertops, a specific brand. I can't answer the specific brand. I think that would have to be something we would look into, unless Jillian knows the brand, but I'm not sure. I think again, it depends on what the counter or the material is made from, or what kind of like surfacing has been put on it. But I think one way you could kind of see is, at least in textiles, the Ecology Center did a PFAS, like a little test. It's called the bead test, and Jillian, did this a year or so ago, where if you drop some water on your couch or something, and if it beads up and really doesn't soak at all, there's likely more PFAS in the product. And if it kind of soaks in, it's less likely. So that's just a small way that you could determine. But yeah, in terms of like harder surfaces, like counters and things, I'm not sure how you would know
You
that.
can't use that test for a countertop, only fabrics, and it's still not perfect, but thank you for that. Yeah.
Harvey, I'll get back to you in a minute. There is a question in the chat. I would like to, I think answer that. Am I correct that the Ann Arbor water system filters out PFAS from the tap water?
Yes, Ann Arbor's water utility spent a lot of money on improved filter material. It's granular activated carbon. The standard filter materials are often activated carbon too, but the better one has like a better surface area and texture to capture more chemicals, including PFAS. So it does a really good job with the long chain PFAS, which are kind of the legacy chemicals like PFOS and PFOA. For those familiar with those, it does a really good job with those. It does filter out shorter chain PFAS as well, but not quite as efficiently. The filter material does have to be changed at regular enough intervals to be effective. And I don't know the intervals. I believe the filter material is sent back to the company that provides it, and I think they regenerate it by burning, which raises its own host of questions. Where did the PFAS go? I guess the filter material might eventually become unusable, not entirely sure, in which case it'll be landfilled. So the PFAS will go somewhere, but yeah, the Ann Arbor water system is way ahead of a lot of municipal systems because it's expensive. Most places don't have the resources to put in those types of filtration.
Harvey, go ahead.
Okay, my question wasn't about that brand. I used that brand name as an example. I asked generically about acrylic countertops and whether or not acrylic countertops shed PFAS. And where I was coming from is there's a community being constructed in Ann Arbor where they're trying to be very safe in a lot of ways, and they're doing geothermal for heating, and they're putting solar panels up and so forth. And one of the things that they are touting is that they learned that most countertop materials like granite and quartz and stone materials that are very popular these days are coated with PFAS. And they decided to not use them. And they found another material. I can't remember its name, but it's got a generic name and it's got a few brand names, but it's basically a very high pressure baked combination of porcelain and who knows what, glass and stone and whatever. And I'm doing a renovation, so I was thinking I would use that. And then I looked into it and I learned that Consumer Reports did a video where they dropped a 1 pound weight from 1 foot up and it cracked it. So it's not always going to be that sensitive, but I've been looking at where can I get materials that aren't shedding PFAS. So is there an understanding that generally acrylic countertops, which is a plastic material, whether it's Corian or some other manufacturer, do they coat them with PFAS or PFAS associated with them? Does anybody know about that? That's what I was asking.
I am not familiar with countertops and PFAS, so I can't answer that about the acrylics. I'll probably go to the Green Science Policy Institute website where they have information about certain kinds of brands and products just to see if they have anything about countertops. But you're welcome to if you want to email one of us with that question so we keep it on our radar.
Is there any other questions?
There was
Oh,
another
Erica.
that was directed to me. I'm not
Yeah.
sure. It was looking at the EWG, the Environmental Working Group, has a map looking at levels of PFAS in water, it's in drinking water. And they wanted to know why some communities show higher levels than others belonging to the same water system. And I was just looking at that map, and to be honest, I can't answer that. I don't know why. I would have to talk to someone at EWG and look at what the source of that is and kind of where they got that. But what I think I can say about that is they are just looking at drinking water levels, and they're also looking at military sites. So it's possible that there's different levels depending on if you're looking at a military site or just looking at a municipal drinking water site. Because you're right, if there's different communities, but they're on the same municipal water system, I wouldn't think that the tests would be different, though maybe there's something I don't know. So I'm not sure if I can answer that. I don't know if Jillian, you have any insight into that one.
Not really. The only thing I would add is if they're taken on at different times, there certainly can be differences, even if it's the same system, because if there are ongoing emissions into water from different facilities, those emissions may be greater or lower at different times of the year. And even if there's a filter system, maybe it doesn't capture all of it.
Do you have other questions, Erica, in your chat? Okay. All right. There is more comment here that you can guys look at it maybe in the chat. Parnell, do you want to talk about this if you want for like, I don't know, 30 seconds or? Okay, maybe not. So, all right, if we have no other questions, we can end the event. And I just wanted to say thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today and being with us here at the event. If you feel inspired and you would like to donate and to support this work, you can go on our website and make a donation. You can make a donation once a year. You can even make monthly donations like $10 or $20 a month. You can set it up easily on our website. It takes less than 5 minutes to do that. My colleague shared the link in the chat box where you can support this type of work. There's one question. I mean, if you want to, guys, just answer in 30 seconds. Is it recommended that citizens request testing for PFAS?
Meaning
Like
I
in
wonder
blood
that,
or water?
I'm not sure. Richard Brown, if you will have like explain in the chat if you want, or if you want to like unmute yourself and explain that question for us so we can answer it. Whatever way that works. Oh, blood.
Blood test.
Test, yes.
I I mean, not necessarily, not like everyone, because um, there are a lot of limitations to the information it gives you, and then what you can do about it. I don't know if I really feel qualified to answer that question, but I mean, if you have a specific concern about your own exposure, it could make sense. I think there's some information on our website about the logistics of that. I mean, there are those Empower DX kits that are home kits that anyone can do, but there are also venous blood draws that can be done through a doctor's office. Although I've heard that insurance doesn't usually pay for that. I don't know much more than that.
Yeah, and I would say if you have a reason, if you feel like you've been occupationally exposed or you had contaminated drinking water, then there might be a good reason to do it. All of us, like 99% of the US population, has some amount of PFAS in our blood. And that's unfortunate. And you likely will find some PFAS. But again, if that's something you just want to know, then that's good. But I think that there's, like Jillian said, limitations to doing that. And really some of these tests have been developed like to know if you've been exposed, kind of what are the health implications for the level of PFAS in your blood. And that's kind of what I think some of the bigger purposes of testing. But yeah, we all have PFAS in our blood. So it's just, that's probably a whole nother webinar that we could go to of how, all of that and what to do about that.
Yeah, I'm sure we do these webinars frequently. So we will definitely do another webinar about this, maybe about like what we can do about this problem. So again, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for being amazing supporters of the Ecology Center. And yeah, have a great evening. And thank you, Erica and Julian. Thank you, Harvey. Bye-bye.